Culture of Angola. Published December the 8th, 2017. Special characters are denoted as follows. And. Left and right parentheses. The culture of Angola is influenced by the Portuguese. Portugal occupied the coastal enclave Luanda, and later also Benguela, since the 16th/17th centuries, and expanded into the territory of what is now Angola in the 19th/20th centuries, ruling it until 1975. Both countries share cultural aspects, language, Portuguese, and main religion, Roman Catholic Christianity. However, the Angolan culture is mostly native Bantu, which was mixed with Portuguese culture. The diverse ethnic communities with their own cultural traits, traditions and native languages or dialects include the Ovimbundu, Ambundu, Bakongo, Chokwe, Avambo and other peoples. Part 1. Ethnic Groups and Languages. There are over 100 distinct ethnic groups and languages/dialects in Angola. Although Portuguese is the official language, for many black Angolans it is a second or even third language. The three dominant ethnic groups are the Ovimbundu, Mbundu, better called Ambundu, speaking Kimbundu, and the Bakongo. There are also small numbers of Mestizo, mixed African and European descent, and ethnic white Europeans as well. Part 1. Ethnic Groups and Languages. Chapter 1. Ovimbundu. The largest ethno-linguistic category, the Ovimbundu, were located in west-central Angola, south of Mbundu inhabited regions. In 1988, the United States Department of State estimated that they constituted 37% of the population. The language of the Ovimbundu is Ambundu. The core area of the Ovimbundu kingdoms was that part of the Benguela Plateau north of the town of Avambo. Expansion continuing into the 20th century enlarged their territory considerably, although most Ovimbundu remained in that part of the plateau above 1,200 meters in elevation. Like most African groups of any size, the Ovimbundu were formed by the mixture of groups of diverse origin and varying size. Little is known of developments before the 17th century, but there is some evidence of additions to the people who occupied the Benguela Plateau at the time. Over time, a number of political entities, usually referred to as kingdoms, were formed. By the 18th century, there were 22 kingdoms. 13 were fully independent. The other 9 were largely autonomous but owed tribute to one of the more powerful entities, usually the Kingdom of Bantu, but in some cases Wambu or Siaka. By the beginning of the second decade of the 20th century, effective occupation by the Portuguese had caused a fairly rapid decline in the power of the heads of these kingdoms, but Ovimbundu continued to think of themselves as members of one or another of the groups based on these political units after World War II. In addition to the groups that clearly spoke dialects of Ambundu, there were 2 on the periphery of Ovimbundu distribution, the Mbi, who seemed to straddle the linguistic boundary between the Ovimbundu and the Mbundu, and the Dom living to the west near the coast, whose language was closely related to Ambundu, although not a dialect of it. The Dom and several other groups, including the Ganda and the Hania, who, according to one account, spoke Ambundu dialects, relied on cattle raising, as did their southern neighbors, the Herero and the Avambo. Still others, typically the old tributary kingdoms, came to speak Ambundu relatively recently, until the Portuguese established firm control over their territory. The Ovimbundu, particularly those of the major kingdoms of Bantu, to the northwest, Bahia, to the northeast, and Wambu, in the center, played important roles as intermediaries in the slave, ivory, and beeswax trades, acting as carriers, entrepreneurs, and raiders. With the decline of the slave trade in the last decades of the 19th century, The entrepreneurs among the Ovimbundu turned to the rubber trade, abandoning the warfare and raiding that had hitherto been integrally related to their economic activities. The rubber slump at the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the de facto autonomy of their kingdoms not long after, and the displacement of Ovimbundu traders by the Portuguese forced these people to turn to cash crop agriculture. The men had hitherto had little involvement with cultivation. In fact, the women continued to be responsible for the cultivation of subsistence crops. The introduction of cash crops, particularly coffee, led to a series of changes in settlement patterns and social arrangements. But after a time, soil exhaustion, lack of support of African agriculture by the colonial authorities, incursions of Portuguese settlers who took over valuable property in the highlands, and a number of other factors contributed to a decline in the success of Ovimbundu cash crop agriculture. By the early 1960s, up to 100,000 Ovimbundu, estimated at 1/4 of the group's able-bodied adult males, were migrating on 1-year and 2-year labor contracts to the coffee plantations of Uige and Kuanza provinces. Another 15,000 to 20,000 sought work in Luanda and Lobito, and roughly the same number worked in the industrial plants of Avambo or for European farmers in the Benguela Plateau. In most cases, remuneration was low, but these migrant workers had little alternative. This pattern continued through the remainder of the colonial period, except for those males who were involved in nationalist activity, usually with UNITA. In the 1940s, the Ovimbundu organized what was probably the most closely knit Angolan community of the colonial era. With the financial and ideological aid of North American Christian missionaries, they established a network of Christian villages, each with its own leadership, schools, churches, and clinics. They were thus able to maintain the Ovimbundu culture while providing educational and social amenities for their children. The generation that emerged from this structure became the disciples of Jonas Savimbi and the basis for UNITA, which in the 1980s used the same concepts to maintain Ovimbundu cohesiveness within UNITA-controlled areas. Given the degree of change in Ovimbundu society and the involvement of the Ovimbundu with UNITA, it was difficult to determine their long-range role in Angolan politics. Just how long Ovimbundu solidarity would persist under changing circumstances could not be predicted. Part 1. Ethnic Groups and Languages. Chapter 2. Mbundu. Just north of Ovimbundu territory lived the Mbundu, the second largest ethno-linguistic category, whose language was Kimbundu. In 1988 they made up an estimated 25% of the Angolan population. In the 16th century, most of the groups that came to be known as Mbundu, a name apparently first applied by the neighboring Bakongo, lived well to the east of the coast in the plateau region, at a somewhat lower altitude than the Ovimbundu. A few groups in the far northeast lived at altitudes below 700 meters. In general, the outlines of the area occupied by the Mbundu had remained the same. The major exception was their expansion of this area to parts of the coast formerly occupied by Bakongo and others. Although most of the boundaries of Mbundu territory remained fairly firm, the social and linguistic boundaries of the category had shifted, some of the peripheral groups having been variably influenced by neighboring groups and the groups close to the coast having been more strongly influenced by the Portuguese than were the more remote ones. Moreover, the subdivisions discernible for the 16th century, and perhaps earlier, also changed in response to a variety of social and linguistic influences in the colonial period. The Mbundu in general and the Western Mbundu in particular, located as they were not far from Luanda, were susceptible to those influences for a longer time and in a more intense way than were other Angolan groups. There were a number of Kimbundu dialects and groups, too, each incorporating Portuguese terms, gradually became dominant, serving as lingua francas for many Mbundu. The Western dialect was centered in Luanda, to which many Mbundu had migrated over the years. The people speaking it, largely urban, had come to call themselves Ambundu or Uanda, thus distinguishing themselves from rural Mbundu. The eastern dialect, known as Ambakista, had its origins in the 18th century in a mixed Portuguese-Mbundu trading centre at Ambaka near the western edge of the Plateau region, but it spread in the 19th century through much of eastern Mbundu territory. Another Kimbundu-speaking group, the Dembos, were generally included in the Mbundu category. Living north of Luanda, they had also been strongly influenced by Kikongo speakers. By the late 1960s, the Mbundu living in the cities, such as Luanda and Malange, had adopted attributes of Portuguese lifestyle. Many had intermarried with Portuguese, which led to the creation of an entirely new class of mesticos. Those who received formal education and fully adopted Portuguese customs became assimilados. The Mbundu were the MPLA's strongest supporters when the movement first formed in 1956. The MPLA's president, Agostinho Neto, was the son of a Mbundu Methodist pastor and a graduate of a Portuguese medical school. In the 1980s, the Mbundu were predominant in Luanda, Bengo, Kwanza North, Malange, and northern Kwanza Sul provinces. Part 1. Ethnic Groups and Languages. Chapter 3. Bakongo. The Kikongo-speaking Bakongo made up an estimated 15% of the Angolan population. In 1988, the Bakongo were the third largest ethno-linguistic group in Angola, concentrated in Uige, Zaire, and Cabinda provinces. Where they constituted a majority of the population, the Bakongo spilled over into the nation of Zaire, where they were the largest single ethnic group, and Congo, although the Angolan city of Sao Salvador, renamed Mbanza Congo, was the capital of their ancient kingdom, most of the Bakongo were situated in Zaire. Their former political unity long broken, the various segments of the ethno-linguistic category in Angola experienced quite different influences in the colonial period. The Basha Congo, living near the coast, had the most sustained interaction with the Portuguese but were less affected by participation in the coffee economy than the Soso and Pombo, who were situated farther east and south. All three groups, however, were involved in the uprising of 1961. The Pombo, still farther east but close to the Zairean border, were much influenced by developments in the Belgian Congo, present-day Zaire, and a large contingent of Pombo living in Leopoldville, present-day Kinshasa, formed a political party in the early 1950s. The Silongo, dwelling on the relatively dry coastal plain, had little contact with the Portuguese. They and the Ashiliuanda of the island of Luanda, to the south, were Angola's only African sea fishermen. The Mayom, also spelled Mayom, of the mountain forests of Cabinda spoke a dialect of Kikongo but were not part of the ancient kingdom. That part of the Mayom living in Zaire did join with the Zairean Bakongo in the Alliance of Bakongo, Alliance des Bakongo, Abako, during the period of party formation in the Belgian Congo, but the Cabindan Mayom and other Kikongo-speaking groups in the enclave, relatively remote geographically and culturally from the Bakongo of Angola proper, showed no solidarity with the latter. Instead, in 1961 the Mayom formed a Cabindan separatist movement, the Alliance of Mayom, Alliance de Mayom Aliama, which merged with two other Cabindan separatist movements in 1963 to form the Front for the Liberation of the Enclave of Cabinda, Front para a Libertar do Enclave de Cabinda, FLEC. One of the first major revolts of the nationalist struggle was instigated by Bakongo in March 1961 in the northwest. The Portuguese crushed the peasant attack, organized by the Bakongo group, the Union of Angolan Peoples, União das Populações de Angola UPA, on their settlements, farms, and administrative outposts. Subsequently, 400,000 Bakongo fled into Zaire. In 1962 the UPA formed the National Front for the Liberation of Angola. Frente Nacional de Libertação de Angola (FNLA), which became one of the three major nationalist groups, the other two being the MPLA and UNITA. Involved in the long and bloody War of Independence, most of the FNLA's traditional Bakongo constituency fled into exile in Zaire during the war. Following independence, however, many Bakongo exiles returned to their traditional homesteads in Angola. They had since retained their ethno-linguistic integrity. The Bakongo are a matriarchal tribe, which means that the women have the authority and power in the tribe. Part 1. Ethnic Groups and Languages. Chapter 4. Lunda Chokwe. The hyphenated category Lunda Chokwe constituted an estimated 8% of the Angolan population in 1988. As the hyphenation implies, the category leading to their inclusion in a single set are recent. The Lunda alone were a congeries of peoples brought together in the far-flung Lunda Empire, 17th century to 19th century. Under the hegemony of a people calling themselves Rund, its capital in the eastern section of Zaire's Katanga province, present-day Shaba province. Lunda is the form of the name used for the Rund and for themselves by adjacent peoples to the south who came under Rund domination. In some sources, the Rund are called Northern Lunda, and their neighbors are called Southern Lunda. The most significant element of the latter, called Ndembu, or Ndembo, lived in Zaire and Zambia. In Angola, the people with whom the northward expanding Chokwe came into contact were chiefly Rund speakers. The economic and political decline of the empire by the second half of the 19th century and the demarcation of colonial boundaries ended Rund political domination over those elements beyond the Zairean borders. The Chokwe, until the latter half of the 19th century, a small group of hunters and traders living near the headwaters of the Kuango and Kasai rivers, were at the southern periphery of the Lunda Empire and paid tribute to its head. In the latter half of the 19th century, the Chokwe became increasingly involved in trading and raiding, and they expanded in all directions, but chiefly to the north, in part absorbing the Rund and other peoples. In the late 19th century, the Chokwe went so far as to invade the capital of the much weakened empire in Katanga. As a consequence of this Chokwe activity, a mixed population emerged in parts of Zaire as well as in Angola, although there were virtually homogeneous communities in both countries consisting of Chokwe, Rund, or Southern Lunda. The intermingling of Lunda, Rund and Southern Lunda, and Chokwe, in which other smaller groups were presumably also caught up, continued until about 1920. It was only after that time that the mixture acquired the hyphenated label and its members began to think of themselves, in some contexts, as one people. The languages spoken by the various elements of the so-called Lunda Chokwe were more closely related to each other and to other Bantu languages in the Zairean Angolan savanna, but were by no means mutually intelligible. The three major tongues, Rund, Lunda, and Chokwe, had long been distinct from each other, although some borrowing of words, particularly of Rund political titles by the others, had occurred. Portuguese anthropologists and some others accepting their work have placed some of the peoples, Minungu and Shinji, in this area with the Mbundu, and the Minungu language is sometimes considered a transitional one between Kimbundu and Chokwe. There may in fact have been important Mbundu influence on these two peoples, but the work of a number of linguists places their languages firmly with the set that includes Rund, Lunda, and Chokwe. Economic and political developments in the 1970s affected various sections of the Lunda Chokwe differently. Substantial numbers of them live in or near Lunda North province, which contains the principal diamond mines of Angola. Diamond mining had been significant since 1920, and pre-independence data show that the industry employed about 18,000 persons. Moreover, the mining company provided medical and educational facilities for its employees and their dependents, thereby affecting even greater numbers. How many of those employed were Lunda Chokwe is not clear, although neighboring villages would have been affected by the presence of the mining complex in any case. In the intra-Angolan political conflict preceding and immediately following independence, there apparently was some division between the northern Lunda Chokwe, especially those with some urban experience, who tended to support the MPLA, and the rural Chokwe, particularly those farther south, who tended to support UNITA. In the 1980s, as the UNITA insurgency intensified in the border areas of eastern and northern Angola, Lunda Chokwe families were forced to flee into Zaire's Shaba province, where many remained in 1988, living in 3 sites along the Benguela Railway. The impact of this move on the ethno-linguistic integrity of these people was not known. A somewhat different kind of political impact began in the late 1960s, when refugees from Katanga in Zaire, speakers of Lunda or a related language, crossed the border into what are now Lunda Sul and northern Moxico provinces. In 1977 and 1978, these refugees and others whom they had recruited formed the National Front for the Liberation of the Congo. Front National pour la Libération du Congo, FNLC, and used the area as a base from which they launched their invasions of Shaba province. In the 1980s, these rebels and perhaps still other refugees remained in Angola, many in Lunda Sul province, although the Angolan government as part of its rapprochement with Zaire was encouraging them to return to their traditional homes. The Zairean government offered amnesty to political exiles on several occasions in the late 1980s and conferred with the Angolan government on the issue of refugees. In 1988, however, a significant number of Zairean refugees continued to inhabit Lundaku territory. The significance for local Lunda Chokwe of the presence and activities of these Zaireans was not known. Part 1. Ethnic Groups and Languages. Chapter 5. Gangela. Gangela is generic term for a number of closely related Bantu languages in southeastern Angola spoken by the Gonzalo, Lushazi, Nyamba, Luval, Lumbi, Mbunda, Mbuela, Yauma and Ngangala ethnic groups. Yauma language and Ngangala language are in turn Mbunda dialects. Ngangala, Mbalango, Sango, Chayungel, Shambuka, and Ndundu are closely related. Part 1. Ethnic Groups and Languages. Chapter 6. Ovambo, Nyanikankumbi, Herero, and others. In far southwestern Angola, 3 categories of Bantu-speaking peoples have been distinguished. 2 of them, the Ovambo and the Herero, were more heavily represented elsewhere, the Ovambo in Namibia and the Herero in Namibia and Botswana. The Herero dispersion, especially that section of it in Botswana, was the consequence of the migration of the Herero from German Southwest Africa. Present-day Namibia. After their rebellion against German rule in 1906. The 3rd group was the Nyanika Hum. Unlike the other groups, the Nyanika Hum did not disperse outside Angola. In 1988 the Nyanika Hum. The first group is also spelled Haneka, the latter group is also spelled Nkumbi. Constituted 3% of the population. The Ovambo, of which the largest subgroup were the Kwanhama, also spelled Kwanyama, made up an estimated 2% of the Angolan population. In the second half of the 19th century, the Kwanhama Kingdom of southern Angola was a powerful state involved in a lucrative trade relationship with the Portuguese, who, together with the Germans, occupied Kwanhama territory in the early 20th century. In the 1980s, the Ovambo were semi-nomadic cattle herders and farmers. The Herero constituted no more than 0.5% of the population in 1988. Traditionally, the Herero were nomadic or semi-nomadic herders living in the arid coastal lowlands and in the mountainous escarpment to the east in Namibe, Benguela, and Huila provinces. Many Herero migrated south to Namibia when the Portuguese launched a military expedition against them in 1940 following their refusal to pay taxes. In the southeastern corner of the country, the Portuguese distinguished a set of Bantu-speaking people, described on a map prepared by José Redinha in 1973 as the Jindonga. The sole linguistic group listed in this category was the Kasu. The language map of Africa, prepared under the direction of David Dolby for the International African Institute, noted two sets of related languages in southeastern Angola. The first set included Liua, Mashi, and Northern Bukashu. These languages and other members of the set were also found in Zambia and Namibia. The members of the second set, Kwangali Gisakuru and Southern Bukashu, were also found in Namibia and Botswana. The hyphen between Kwangali and Gisakuru implies mutual intelligibility. Little is known of these groups. In any case, their members were very few. All of these southern Angolan groups relied in part or in whole on cattle raising for subsistence. Formerly, the Herero were exclusively herders, but they gradually came to engage in some cultivation. Although the Ovambo had depended in part on cultivation for a much longer time, dairy products had been an important source of subsistence, and cattle were the chief measure of wealth and prestige. The southwestern groups, despite their remoteness from the major centers of white influence during most of the colonial period, were to varying degrees affected by the colonial presence and, after World War II, by the arrival of numbers of Portuguese in such places as Mocametes, present-day Namibe, and Sardarbandra, present-day Lubango. The greatest resistance to the Portuguese was offered by the Ovambo, who were not made fully subject to colonial rule until 1915 and who earned a considerable reputation among the Portuguese and other Africans for their efforts to maintain their independence. In the nationalist struggle of the 1960s and early 1970s and in the post-independence Civil War, the Ovambo tended to align themselves with the Ovimbundu-dominated UNITA. Many also sympathized with the cause of SWAPO, a mostly Ovambo organization fighting to liberate Namibia from South African rule. Part 1. Ethnic Groups and Languages. Chapter 7. Hunters, Gatherers, Herders, and Others. Throughout the lower third of Angola, chiefly in the drier areas, were small bands of people. Until the 20th century, most of them were nomadic hunters and gatherers, although some engaged in herding, either in addition to their other subsistence activities or as their chief means of livelihood. Those who survived turned, at least in part, to cultivation. The bands living a nomadic or semi-nomadic life in Ku and Okubango province, and occasionally reaching as far east as the Upper Kunene River, differed physically and linguistically from their sedentary Bantu-speaking neighbors. Short, saffron-colored, and in other respects physically unlike the Gangala, Ovambo, and Nyanika Hum, they spoke a language of the exclamation mark Zoo, Angola or Maligo set of tongues referred to as Kizan or click languages. The exclamation point denotes a specific kind of click, whose precise relations to each other are not yet fully understood by observers. Several of the hunting and gathering or herding groups, the members of which were taller and otherwise physically more like the local Bantu speakers, lived farther west, adjacent to the Ovambo and Herero. These people spoke Bantu languages and were less nomadic than the Kizan speakers, but they were clearly different from the Ovambo and Herero and probably preceded them in the area. As with most African art, the wooden masks and sculptures of Angola are not merely aesthetic creations. They play an important role in cultural rituals, representing life and death, the passage from childhood to adulthood, the celebration of a new harvest and the marking of the hunting season. Angolan artisans work in wood, bronze, ivory, malachite or ceramic mediums. Each ethno-linguistic group in Angola has its own unique artistic traits. Perhaps the single most famous piece of Angolan art is the Chokwe thinker, a masterpiece of harmony and symmetry of line. The Lunda Chokwe in the northeastern part of Angola is also known for its superior plastic arts. Other signature pieces of Angolan art include the female musk manapo worn by male dancers in their puberty rituals, the polychromatic kalelwa masks used during circumcision ceremonies, sikungu and sihongo masks which conjure up the images of the Lunda Chokwe mythology. Two key figures in this pantheon are Princess Lweji and the civilizing Prince Chabinda Alunga, and the black ceramic art of Moxico of central/eastern Angola. Part 1, Ethnic Groups and Languages. Chapter 8, Mestico. In 1960, a little more than 1% of the total population of Angola consisted of mesticos. It has been estimated that by 1970 these people constituted perhaps 2% of the population. Some mesticos left at independence, but the departure of much greater numbers of Portuguese probably resulted in an increase in the proportion of mesticos in the Angolan total. In 1988, mesticos probably continued to number about 2% of the Angolan population. The process of mixing started very early and continued until independence, but it was not until about 1900, when the number of Portuguese in Angola was very small and consisted almost entirely of males, that the percentage of mesticos in the population exceeded the percentage of whites. After a number of generations, the antecedents of many mesticos became mixed to the extent that the Portuguese felt a need to establish a set of distinctions among them. Many mesticos accepted this system as a means of social ranking. One source suggests that the term mestico, used alone in a social context, applied specifically to the offspring of a mulatto and a white. The term mestico cabrito referred to the descendant of a union between two mulattoes, and the term mestico cafuso was applied to the child of a union between a mulatto and a black African. It is possible that an even more complex set of distinctions was sometimes used. Most mesticos were urban dwellers and had learned to speak Portuguese either as a household language or in school. Although some of the relatively few rural mesticos lived like the Africans among whom they dwelt, most apparently achieved the status of assimilados. The term applied before 1961 to those non-whites who fulfilled certain specific requirements and were therefore registered as Portuguese citizens. With some exceptions, mesticos tended to identify with Portuguese culture, and their strongly voiced opposition over the years to the conditions imposed by the colonial regime stressed their right to a status equivalent to that of whites. Before World War II, only occasionally did mestico intellectuals raise their voices on behalf of the African population. Thus, despite the involvement of mesticos in the nationalist struggle beginning in 1961 and their very important role in the upper echelons of the government and party, significant segments of the African population tended to resent them. This legacy continued in the late 1980s because mesticos dominated the MPLA-PT hierarchy. Starting in the late 1970s, an average of 50,000 Cuban troops and civilian technical personnel, the overwhelming majority of whom were male, were stationed in Angola. As a result, a portion of the nation's younger population was undoubtedly of mixed African and Cuban descent. This new category of racial mixture, however, had not been described by researchers as of late 1988, and no figures existed on how many Angolans might fall into this category. Part 2. Music. Part 3. National Identity. This recording is a derivative work from Wikipedia. For more information, please visit www.frogcast.org.